d4. Queen's pawn opening, opening line. The queen's pawn opening move is somewhat slower than the popular e4 because white will not be able to castle for 3 more moves. Its advantage is that it gives white more control over tactical surprises and often provides more lasting initiative and pressure. Knight f6. Indian defense, opening line. The immediate development of the knight is the most supple response to the queen's pawn opening, allowing transposition into virtually every type of defense at black's disposal. c4. Indian defense, opening line. White with c4 tries to restrict black's options in attacking the center. g6. Indian defense, opening line. The fianchetto is common to many black defenses to the queen-pawn opening. Knight c3. Indian defense, opening line. Bishop g7. Indian defense, king's Indian defense, opening line. In the king's Indian, black completes his kingside fianchetto development, allowing white to play e4. e4. Indian defense, king's Indian defense, opening line. d6. Indian defense, king's Indian defense, 6 pawns attack, opening line. Bishop e2. Indian defense, king's Indian defense, Averbach variation, opening line. The Averbach variation against the king's Indian, characterized by development of the bishops at e2 and g5. Castle kingside. Indian defense, king's Indian defense, Averbach variation, opening line. Bishop e3. Indian defense, king's Indian defense, semi-Averbach system, opening line. Knight c6. Out of opening book. d5. Threatens black's knight at c6. Knight e5. Moves it to safety and blocks white's pawn at e4. h3. e6. f4. Threatens black's knight at e5. Knight e d7. Moves it to safety. d takes e6. Attacks black's knight at d7. f takes e6. Removes the threat on black's knight at d7. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. g4. b6. Queen c2. Makes way for a castle to the queenside. Bishop b7. Pins white's pawn at e4. Castle queenside. Knight c5. Blocks white's pawn at c4. Bishop f3. Frees white's pawn at e4 from the pin. Knight f d7. e5. Partially pins black's bishop at b7. Queen e7. e takes d6. Forks black's pawn at c7 and black's queen and isolates black's pawn at e6. c takes d6. Removes the threat on black's queen. Bishop takes b7. Threatens black's rook at a8. Knight takes b7. Protects black's rook at a8. Black wins a bishop and a pawn for a bishop and a pawn. Material is even. Knight g e2. Rook a c8. attacks white's pawn at c4. Queen d3 protects white's pawn at c4. Knight d c5 threatens white's queen and blocks white's pawn at c4. Queen c2 moves it to safety. Knight a5 attacks white's pawn at c4. Bishop d4. Slightly better is b3. Analyzing. The chess master recommends pawn to b3. You move your pawn to b3, which removes the threat on your pawn at c4. Black counters with rook at f8 to d8. You move your king to b1. Black responds by moving pawn to d5. Your pawn captures pawn, which isolates black's pawn at e6. Black responds with pawn takes pawn, which attacks your bishop and creates a passed pawn on d5. You move your bishop to d4, which moves it out of harm's way and blocks black's pawn at d5. Black responds with queen to f7. Your bishop captures bishop. Black answers with king takes bishop. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a bishop and a pawn for a bishop and a pawn. In addition, black's attack potential is somewhat decreased. Also, black's pawn formation is somewhat disrupted. Lastly, the pressure on black's king is slightly increased. Bishop d4. Slightly better is b3. Knight takes c4. Creates a passed pawn on d6. Black wins a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. King b1. d5. Advances the passed pawn. f5. Bishop takes d4. Rook takes d4. Blocks black's pawn at d5. White wins a bishop for a bishop. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Knight e3. Slightly better is knight e4. Evaluating. The chess master recommends knight to e4. You move your knight to e4. White responds by moving rook to g1. You move your king to h8. White replies by moving the king to a1. Your pawn at g6 captures pawn, which creates a passed pawn on e6. White answers with pawn captures pawn. You move your knight to e3, which attacks white's queen. White responds with the queen to d3, which moves it to safety and threatens your knight at e3. Your knight captures knight. White counters with queen takes knight at e3, which partially pins your pawn at e6. Your knight captures knight, which forks white's rook at g1 and white's rook at d4. White counters with queen takes knight, which removes the threat on white's rook at d4 and white's rook at g1. Your rook takes pawn, which frees your pawn at e6 from the pin and creates a passed pawn on e6. As a result of this line of play, you win 2 knights and 2 pawns for 2 knights and a pawn. Additionally, your mobility is somewhat increased. Also, white's pawn formation is somewhat disrupted. Knight e3. Slightly better is knight e4. Queen d2. Moves it to safety and attacks black's knight at e3. E takes f5. Protects black's knight at e3. Black wins a pawn. Black is ahead by 2 pawns in material. Knight f4. Blocks black's pawn at f5. Knight c4. Attacks white's queen. Queen g2. Moves it to safety. Knight e4. Knight c takes d5. Threatens black's queen. White wins a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Knight c d2 check. Protects black's queen and checks white's king. King a1. Slightly better is rook takes d2. Evaluating. The chess master recommends rook takes knight. Your rook captures knight at d2, which removes the threat on your king and attacks black's queen. Black answers with knight captures rook, which protects black's queen and checks your king. You move your king to a1, which moves it out of check and attacks black's queen. Black counters by moving the queen to e4, which moves it out of immediate danger and skewers your queen. Your queen takes queen. Black responds with pawn captures queen, which creates a passed pawn on e4. You move your knight to e7, which forks black's rook at c8 and black's king. Black responds with the king to f7, which moves it out of check and threatens your knight at e7. Your knight captures rook, which attacks black's pawn at a7. Black counters with rook captures knight, which removes the threat on black's pawn at a7. You move your knight to d5. Black replies by moving rook to d8, which attacks your knight. You move your knight to c3, which moves it to safety. Black responds with the pawn to e3, which pushes the passed pawn. You move your rook to e1, which attacks black's pawn at e3. Black replies by moving rook to e8, which protects black's pawn at e3 and places it behind the passed pawn at e3. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a queen, a rook, and a knight. For a queen, a rook, and a knight. Additionally, the mobility of black's pieces is greatly decreased. Also, the pressure on your king is somewhat decreased. King a1. Slightly better is rook takes d2. Queen c5. Moves it to safety and attacks white's rook at d4. Knight e2. Protects white's rook at d4. f4. Creates a passed pawn on f4. b4 attacks black's queen. Queen c2. Slightly better is f3. Cogitating. The chess master recommends pawn to f3. You move your pawn to f3, which forks white's knight at e2 and white's queen and pushes the passed pawn. White answers with queen takes pawn, which protects white's knight at e2. Your knight captures queen, which attacks white's rook at d4. White counters with pawn, captures queen. Your knight captures rook, which removes the threat on your knight at e4 and attacks white's knight at e2. White answers with knight takes knight. Your rook takes pawn, which attacks white's knight at d5. White counters with the knight to e7, which moves it to safety and checks your king. You move your king to f7, which moves it out of check and threatens white's knight at e7. White responds by moving the knight at e7 to c6, which moves it out of immediate danger and attacks your pawn at a7. You move your pawn to a6, which moves it to safety. White responds with the rook to b1, which attacks your pawn at b6. You move your pawn to b5, which moves it out of harm's way. As a result of this line of play, you win a queen, a rook, and a pawn for a queen, a knight, and a pawn. In addition, white's attack potential is greatly decreased. Also, white's pawn formation is somewhat disrupted. Queen c2. Slightly better is f3. Rook c1 leads to f3. Rook takes c2. Rook takes c2. Knight e3. F takes g2. Knight takes c2. Rook f2. Rook d8. Check. King f7. Knight c d4. Knight c3. Rook d7. Check. King e8. Rook takes a7. Knight takes e2, which wins a queen, a rook, and a pawn for a queen, a rook, and a knight. Better is knight e7. Check. Leading to king f7. Rook takes d2. Knight takes d2. Knight takes c8. f3. Queen g3. F takes e2. Queen f4. Check. King g7. Queen d4. Check. King g8. Queen d5. Check. Rook f7. Knight e7. Check. King g7, which wins a rook and a knight for a rook and a knight. Queen takes c1. Check. Leads to knight takes c1. Rook takes c1. Check. King b2. f3, which wins a rook and a knight for a queen. Better is f3. Leading to rook takes c2. Rook takes c2. Knight e3. F takes g2. Knight takes c2. Rook f2. Rook d8. Check. King f7. Knight c d4. Knight c3. Rook d7. Check. King e8. Rook takes a7. Knight takes e2, which wins a queen, a rook, and a knight for a queen, a rook, and a pawn. Knight takes c1. Forced removes the threat on white's king. Rook takes c1. Check. Checks white's king. White wins. king b2. Forced moves it out of check and attacks black's rook at c1. f3. Slightly better is rook b1 check. Evaluating. The chess master recommends pawn to f3. You move your pawn to f3, which attacks white's queen and advances the passed pawn. White counters with queen captures knight, which threatens your knight at e4. Your knight captures queen. White counters with king captures rook. You move your pawn to f2, which adds a promote threat at f2. White replies by moving knight to e3. You move your pawn to f1 with a queen promotion, which forks white's king and white's pawn at h3. White answers with knight takes queen, which removes the threat on white's pawn at h3 and white's king. Your knight captures knight. White counters with rook to d3. You move your rook to f2, which threatens white's pawn at a2. White responds by moving rook to d8, which removes the threat on white's pawn at a2 and checks your king. You move your king to g7, which moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at a2. White responds by moving the rook to d7, which removes the threat on white's pawn at a2 and forks your king and your pawn at a7. You move your rook to f7, which removes the threat on your pawn at a7 and your king and attacks white's rook. White responds with rook to d3, which moves it to safety. As a result of this line of play, you win a queen and a knight for a rook and a knight. In addition, white's attack potential is decreased. f3. Slightly better is rook b1 check. Queen h2. Slightly better is queen takes d2. Thinking. The chess master recommends queen captures knight. Your queen captures knight, which attacks black's knight at e4. Black responds with knight takes queen. Your king takes rook. Black counters by moving the pawn to f2, which adds a promote threat at f2. You move your knight to e3. Black responds with pawn to f1 with a queen promotion, which forks your king and your pawn at h3. Your knight takes queen, which removes the threat on your pawn at h3 and your king. Black answers with knight captures knight. You move your rook to d3. Black responds by moving the rook to f2, which attacks your pawn at a2. You move your rook to d8, which removes the threat on your pawn at a2 and checks black's king. Black responds with king to g7, which moves it out of check and threatens your pawn at a2. You move your rook to d7, which removes the threat on your pawn at a2 and forks black's king and black's pawn at a7. Black responds with the rook to f7, which removes the threat on Black's pawn at a7 and Black's king and attacks your rook. You move your rook to d3, which moves it to safety. As a result of this sequence of moves, Black's mobility is greatly decreased. Additionally, Black's pawn formation is disrupted. Also, the pressure on your king is significantly decreased. However, losing a queen and a knight for a rook and a knight cannot be avoided. Queen h2. Slightly better is queen takes d2. Rook b1, check, moves it to safety and checks White's king. King a3 leads to f2, knight e7, check, king h8, queen e5, check, knight f6, rook f4, knight c4, check, rook takes c4, f1, queen c3, queen e1, queen d3, rook c1, rook c6, rook takes c6, knight takes c6. Better is king c2, leading to f2, knight e7, check, king g7, queen e5, check, rook f6, g5, f1, queen g takes f6, check, queen takes f6, queen takes f6, check, king takes f6, knight takes g6, h takes g6, rook takes e4, knight takes e4, king takes b1, which gains a queen, a rook, and a pawn, and loses a queen, a knight, and a pawn in comparison. f2 adds a promote threat at f2. Knight e7, check, checks Black's king. King f7 leads to queen c7, king e6, queen d7, check, king e5, knight c6, check, king f4, queen d6, check, king e3, rook takes e4, check, knight takes e4, queen d4, check, king f4, queen e5, check, king f3, knight d4, check, king e3. Better is king g7, leading to queen e5, check, rook f6, knight f5, check, g takes f5, rook d7, check, king g6, queen c7, king g5, rook takes h7, knight c4, check, queen takes c4, f1, queen takes f1, rook takes f1, g takes f5, which gains a queen and a knight, and loses a rook and 3 pawns by comparison. Queen f4, check, leads to king g7, queen e5, check, rook f6, knight f5, check, g takes f5, rook d7, check, king g6, queen c7, king g5, rook takes h7, knight c4, check, queen takes c4, f1, queen takes f1, rook takes f1, g takes f5. Better is queen c7, leading to king e6, queen d7, check, king e5, knight c6, check, king f4, queen d6, check, king e3, rook takes e4, check, knight takes e4, queen d4, check, king f4, queen e5, check, king f3, knight d4, check, king e3, which gains a queen and a knight and loses a rook and 3 pawns in comparison. King e8. Danger! leads to knight f5, rook takes f5, g takes f5, king f7, queen e5, knight f6, queen c7, check, king f8, rook d8, check, knight e8, queen d6, check, king g7, rook d7, check, king h6, queen takes d2, check, g5, queen takes f2. Much better is king g7, leading to queen e5, check, rook f6, knight f5, check, g takes f5, rook d7, check, king g6, queen c7, king g5, rook takes h7, knight c4, check, queen takes c4, f1, queen takes f1, rook takes f1, g takes f5, which gains a queen and a rook and loses 2 pawns in comparison. This mistake led to a lost game for black. However, white let black back into the game and later resigned. Queen e5. Yikes! Leads to rook f3, check, king a4, knight c3, check, king a3, knight takes a2, check, rook d3, rook takes d3, check, king takes a2, rook a3, check, king takes a3, knight c4, check, king a2, knight takes e5, king takes b1, f1, queen, check, king a2, king takes e7, g5, queen takes h3. Much better is knight f5, leading to rook takes f5, g takes f5, king f7, queen e5, knight f6, queen c7, check, king f8, rook d8, check, knight e8, queen d6, check, king g7, rook d7, check, king h6, queen takes d2, check, g5, queen takes f2, which gains 2 queens, a rook, and 2 pawns, and loses a rook in comparison. This was white's key miscue in the game. White did regain the lost ground, but later resigned. Rook f3, check, forks white's pawn at h3 and white's king. King a4, moves it out of check. b5, check, ouch, hangs the pawn at b5. Leads to queen takes b5, check, king f8, knight takes g6, check, king g7, rook d7, check, king takes g6, queen h5, check, king f6, g5, check, king e5, g6, check, rook f5, rook d5, check, king takes d5, queen takes f5, check, king c4, g takes h7, rook takes b4, check, king a5. Much better is knight c3, check, leading to king a3, knight takes a2, check, rook d3, rook takes d3, check, king takes a2, rook a3, check, king takes a3, knight c4, check, king a2, knight takes e5, king takes b1, f1, queen, check, king a2, king takes e7, g5, queen takes h3, which gains 2 queens and 3 pawns and loses a rook and a knight by comparison. King a5, uh-oh, leads to rook a3, check, king takes b5, f1, queen, check, king c6, queen f6, check, queen takes f6, knight takes f6, rook takes d2, king takes e7, rook e2, check, king f7, g5, rook c3, check, king b5, knight d5. Much better is queen takes b5, check, leading to King f8, knight takes g6, check. King g7, rook d7, check. King takes g6, queen h5, check. King f6, g5, check. King e5, g6, check. Rook f5, rook d5, check. King takes d5, queen takes f5, check. King c4, g takes h7, rook takes b4, check. King a5, which gains a queen, a rook, and a pawn, and loses a rook, a knight, and a pawn in comparison. Rook a3, check, forks white's king and white's pawn at a2, and blocks white's pawn at a2. King takes b5. Forced isolates black's pawn at a7. f1, queen, check, checks white's king, black loses. King c6, moves it out of check. Queen f6, check, skewers white's queen and forks white's king and white's queen. White resigns.